Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
I'm Dr. Lamar Wilson, one of the co-organizers of this event, and to formally welcome you is our chair in English, Andrew Epstein.
Everybody hear me? Yeah? Okay. Thank you all for coming. I'm Andrew Epstein, and I'm the chair of the Department of English here at FSU, and I'm a professor in our Literature, Media, and Culture program. And I'm so happy to be able to welcome you, all of you here in Williams, and if anybody's watching elsewhere, to the first part of this exciting multi-part and now multi-week event that we've titled Going to Mars with Nikki Giovanni and Fred Moten. As you've probably heard, and maybe we'll hear more about, but due to the hurricane, Nikki Giovanni will be joining us a little later on October 24th. But that will be part 2. But today, we're very excited to kick off part 1 of this event. So Going to Mars with Nikki Giovanni and Fred Moten has been in the works for a long time, about a year and a half now. And to plan a large-scale event like this is especially time-consuming and complicated. So I first just want to give the first of probably many thanks to Dr. Ali Sperling and Dr. Lamar Wilson, professors in the FSU English department, for putting together this wonderful series of events. I can't thank them enough for their vision in conceiving of this idea, their energy and imagination in coming up with all of the elements of this event, and their hard work and the countless hours they spent in making this happen. I also want to thank our amazing hardworking staff in the English department for all of their assistance in the logistics and advertising for this event, especially Joanna Petty, Carolyn Hall, Jesse Jackson, and Jack Clifford. This event is somewhat unusual in that it has the support of many different facets of our large English department. So I want to thank the Literature, Media, and Culture program, the Creative Writing program, the Rhetoric and Composition program, and the Diversity Committee for doing so much to support this event. I also want to thank Dr. Aaron Jaffe, the Francis Cushing Irvin Professor of Literature, for his generous support. And this event has been truly interdisciplinary and collaborative, and kind of somewhat rare event that reaches across our enormous campus and across departments and colleges. And so I just want to thank the FSU's Civil Rights Institute of the College of Social Sciences and Public Policy for serving as our partner in making this event happen. It's been a pleasure to work with you on bringing this event to fruition. And I also want to thank the African American Studies program for their generous support as well. We're particularly excited and pleased to be hosting this event because it's exactly the kind of programming we seek to offer in the English department here. We're always aiming to create spaces where intellectual and creative dialogue about literature, language, art, culture, history, and politics can take place. Just on the personal level, as a scholar of modern and contemporary poetry myself, I'm very excited that one of our biggest events of this year brings to campus 2 of the towering figures of 20th and 21st century American poetry, renowned representatives of 2 different generations, whose groundbreaking work continues to reverberate across the landscape of American poetry and culture. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to part 1 of Going to Mars with Nikki Giovanni and Fred Moten, and to welcome Professor Fred Moten to Tallahassee and to FSU.
Thank you, Andrew. So my name is Lamar Wilson, and as Andrew said, this is a culmination of 18 months of planning and 2 months of dialogue among our colleagues and undergraduate and graduate students across several departments and programs. Of these 2 luminaries whose works over the past 3 generations have defined the many sea changes in Black artisanry and what Moten and others astutely recast from the Black arts and hip-hop movements to the Black radical tradition. This tradition's North American and Caribbean origins certainly precede but are indelibly defined in the US by the wails and moans emanating from the bowels of ships diabolically given misnomers like Mercy, Esperanza, and the good ship Jesus, became codified in the ensuing so-called Negro spirituals that continue to inspire Giovanni and all artists with a consciousness and who know what's up, and transform the pathos and tragicomedy of the Black diasporic experience in this fraud-charged moment into the out-of-this-world memes and TikTok clips, dances, and trends we, our kids, and yes, Taylor Swift and her boo are so eager to make borrowed currency of, and yet struggle to imitate. At the center of the fortnight ahead of us is Professor Giovanni, whose genre-blending writing, music, and television production serves as a palimpsest between that not-so-distant chattel past we refuse to enter that will not stop haunting us, and the present and future terrors and joys and triumphs that inundate our timelines and our idealized afterlives on that night star, the moon, and our neighbor, that great red planet, Mars. As Moten no doubt will remind us today in his talk, A Forward Thrust of Blackness, Giovanni has always been talking to us, not at us, about the wisdom Black women can share about where we've been, why we are where we are, and what is inevitably and imminently before us if we don't look back. It's no accident that every person who encounters her singular conversational voice has to acknowledge its incisive accessibility and its bite. No wonder Giovanni earned the title of the Princess of Black Poetry from the 20th century's greatest thought leader and interlocutor, James Baldwin himself, whose centennial the world has been marking this year. Two landmark events inspired this collaboration between Allie and me. One of those viral moments, a clip from Giovanni's 1971 conversation with Baldwin, which aired on the PBS show she produced with Ellis Hayslip, Soul, and the global embrace of a 2022 HBO documentary about Giovanni's life, which took Sundance by storm, winning its top prize, and recently won a Creative Arts Emmy. When Allie mentioned her desire to bring Moten, one of the kindest humans I know, without whom I wouldn't have a PhD, I immediately said yes, as Giovanni taught me to do when you intuit the rightness and righteousness of something. And also, I said, only if we also bring Nikki Giovanni. So thank you, Allie, for saying yes to this wild but necessary conversation across generations. Your tireless efforts have single-handedly united more entities on campus than I can name. Your good wit and pluck and refusal to give up on a good idea is the reason we're all here today.
Thanks.
Andrew is very humble, but our chair always says yes, or says, let's figure it out. And he said that over and over every time our budget had to morph for the new hiccup we couldn't have anticipated. So we say thank you to Andrew for being such a kind presence in our department. And to the English office staff, Joanna Petty, Carolyn Hall, Jesse Jackson, for taking care of our guests' needs with such care, precision, and attention, and helping us connect with campus partners and venues. Thanks to our chief co-sponsor, the Civil Rights Institute, and especially its director, Ted Ellis, who's here with us. And key board members and FSU treasurers, Dabi and Fred Flowers, and key members of the College of Arts and Sciences and the College of Social Sciences and Public Policy, particularly social media director Rebecca Sage, and our colleagues in the English, creative writing, and composition, literature, media, and cultural studies programs, who said yes and gave us money and brought your students out to support this event. And to our other co-sponsor, the African American Studies program, particularly Chair Katrinelle Davis, who has had her students involved, and our Francis Cushing Irvin Chair of American Literature, Aaron Jaffe, who is somewhere in the room. Some of these names you heard, but I'm like gonna call them out so they can get them on. And also to the English Diversity Committee and its chair, John McKilgore, who helped to support us. And for all our graduate student volunteers and leaders of the lead-in events, particularly Emilio Carrero and Najla Stanley, who I think are here somewhere. And the literary journal, the Kudzu Review, who had a beautiful exhibition and retrospective honoring the lives of Giovanni and Moten through multimedia programming. To our librarian in the English department, Mallory Rawls, who helped lead a training and who always finds a way to support whatever it is that you want to do in the English department for students. To our respondent of the day on today's talk, and who will lead our Q&A, Alicia Gaines, the Timothy Gannon Associate Professor of English. And our tech team here today, Kyle Wilson, and his GeoSet team sorry, she asked me to do this because she knows this is the awkward moment where people get tired of clapping. But I'm going to ask you to do it. I'll be happy to do the awkward thing. I'm already awkward. It's okay. And for those of you who have not still yet heard, the screening at the Tallahassee Challenger Learning Center tonight at 7 is happening. So we want you to leave the space, but not leave the spirit of the space, and join us to watch Going to Mars tonight at 7 there. As many of you know, as Andrew's already said, Professor Giovanni will be back with us on the 24th so that we can continue this conversation 2 weeks from today in the student ballroom. And so now I will turn it over to Allie for a formal introduction of today's speaker.
Okay, I feel like I need to be closer. Can you guys hear me in the back? It's okay? Okay, cool. Okay, so thank you, Andrew. Thank you so much, Lamar, for these beautiful remarks and expressions of our gratitude to so many of you that have made this happen. And thank you all for being here. Thank you to those that are joining us online as well. I also want to thank and acknowledge Lamar. I'm so grateful for his trust to embark on this project together. It's been a joy to get to know you, Lamar, through this mutual love of both Nikki and Fred's work. So for that, I'm very grateful. This event is possible because of you. As Lamar has already told us, Going to Mars serves as the title of these paired events, though now with a slightly longer pause between them, with Nikki Giovanni and Fred Moten. In part, a celebration of this beautiful film, Going to Mars, the Nikki Giovanni Project, that we will have the pleasure to watch under the dome of the planetarium tonight. But it's also a framing that Lamar and I knew intuitively would resonate deeply with Fred Moten's work as well. It was 2021, for example, when I was in my apartment in Berlin with a couple of close friends who had joined me to watch two things online that were happening simultaneously. It was February 18th. On one laptop screen was Fred Moten at Johns Hopkins University, delivering the third of a series of lectures titled This Unholding's Long Night Lounge. On the second screen, somewhere mid-lecture, I think, the Perseverance rover was landing on Mars, within the Jezero crater on the so-named Octavia E. Butler landing site. Coincidence, perhaps, though for me, Moten's thinking has always been planetary, and the influence of Butler's work on his own always there in his mind. Going to Mars may be the title of Nikki Giovanni's film as words from her 2003 poem, but both Giovanni and Moten's outer space imaginaries are less about an unknown future and more about the ways in which futurity can only be accessed, if at all, through the study of Black history and Blackness. Like most things worthy of study, Fred Moten's work is impossible to describe or contain. He is, over and over, attempting in his writing to evade forms of capture and singularity. His life is testament to this. Among other things, he is a poet, a theorist, a philosopher, a musician, a collaborator of all kinds, a performance artist, a public voice we all look to, a mentor and a teacher. Moten is never alone in his work. He returns to countless jazz musicians, to Nathaniel Mackey, Hannah Arendt, Frantz Fanon, Cedric Robinson, Edouard Glissant, Octavia Butler, Hortense Spillers, Robin Kelly, Marx, and always Saidiya Hartman. His writing and talks are generous, associative, jazz-infused and rhythmic, and effusively citational. His work is something that one rehearses more than one reads. Fred Moten's intellectual and artistic contributions are immeasurable to Black studies, performance studies, sound studies, contemporary art, poetry and poetics, critical race theory, and the Black radical tradition, to name only a few of those recognizable within the institutions his work also crucially rethinks. He is the author of The Undercommons, Fugitive Planning in Black Study with Stefano Harney. In The Break, The Aesthetics of the Black Radical Tradition from 2003, The 2017 to 18 trilogy, Consent Not to Be a Single Being, which includes Black and Blur, Stolen Life, and The Universal Machine, among many other critical works. His collections of poetry, to name only a few, include I Ran From It But Was Still In It, 2007, B. Jenkins, 2010, The Field Trio, 2014, All That Beauty, 2019, and Perennial Fashion Presents Falling from last year. Among awards and distinctions too many to name, in 2020, Moten was awarded a MacArthur Fellowship for creating new conceptual spaces to accommodate emerging forms of Black aesthetics, cultural production, and social life. He has held positions at Duke, Brown, and the University of Iowa, and is currently professor of performance studies at NYU. After the talk today, as Lamar already indicated, we are very lucky to have our own Dr. Alicia Gaines to offer a response and moderate Q&A with all of you. Fred Moten's talk today is titled A Forward Thrust of Blackness. On behalf of Lamar and all of those who made this happen, please join me in welcoming Fred Moten.
Thank you. I'm very conscious of the time, and I heard Professor Sperling say at lunch that we have to be out of here by 4:40. So I'm going to try to be finished. We'll see by 4:15, because I found that. For me, at least, the best thing about the talk is Q&A. But before I start, I want to say a couple words of thanks to there's so many people to thank, and I'm so honored and happy to be here, for this occasion. I want to thank Ted Ellis from the Civil Rights Institute, Professor Davis from African American Studies, Professor Epstein from English, Professor Gaines in advance for her, what you're going to do, and I know it's going to be good. And obviously my old friend, Professor Wilson, and my new friend, Professor Sperling. It's been really fun preparing for this, and it's been really great being here the last 24 hours, and I'm looking forward to the next 24 hours. I hesitate to do this, but I always feel like I have to, because for some reason, I don't know why, people keep thinking that I worked at Brown. And I don't know why, because I never have. And I hate Brown. No, it's just, I think the greatest artist in the world right now is extraordinary poet and visual artist named Renee Gladman.
Yeah.
And they didn't give Renee Gladman tenure. So I have not set foot on their campus since then. Although I have lots of friends, who work there, and I like them. But I won't actually go on the campus. I'll go close to the campus, but I won't. And obviously, the main person to thank is Nikki Giovanni. And obviously, we're both, sad that she's not here today. But on the other hand, we're happy that she's here today, because she's everywhere, every day, and we know that we'll get to see her here again. See her here soon. I feel like really my task here is sort of double, but on the one hand, maybe, I am totally in love with the idea that at some point I could actually be, conversing with her. But I'm also just as happy to be opening for her. And at the same time, the irony, of course, is that I can't open for her because in fact she's opened for me. She made a way for us, and she makes a way for these brief remarks that I want to offer you today. So what I would like to do is to begin with reading with her reading the poem that is one of the inspirations for this event. And the poem is called Quilting the Black-Eyed Pea, and the subtitle is We're Going to Mars. So we'll start with that, and then you'll see that everything that I'm trying to say, she's already said way better. So.
I wrote a poem, Quilting the Black-Eyed Pea, We're Going to Mars. We're going to Mars for the same reason Marco Polo rocketed to China, for the same reason Columbus trimmed his sails on a dream of spices, for the very same reason Shackleton was enchanted with penguins, for the reason we fall in love. It's the only adventure. We're going to Mars because Perry couldn't go to the North Pole without Matthew Henson, because Chicago couldn't be a city without Jean-Baptiste de Sable, because George Washington Carver and his peanut were the right partners for Booker T. It's a life-seeking thing. We're going to Mars because whatever is wrong with us will not get right with us. So we journey forth carrying the same baggage, but every now and then leaving one little bitty thing behind, maybe drop torturing hunchbacks here, maybe drop lynching Billy Budd there, maybe not whipping Uncle Tom to death, maybe resisting global war, one day looking for prejudice to slip, one day looking for hatred to tumble by the wayside, one day maybe the whole community will no longer be vested and who sleeps with whom. Maybe one day the Jewish community will be at rest, the Christian community will be content, the Muslim community will be at peace, and all the rest of us will get great meals on holy days and learn new songs and sing in harmony. We're going to Mars because it gives us a reason to change. If Mars came here, it would be ugly. Nations would band together to hunt down and kill Martians. And being the stupid, undeserving life forms that we are, we would also hunt down and kill what would be termed Martian sympathizers. As if the fugitive slave law wasn't bad enough then, as if the so-called war on terrorism isn't pitiful now. When do we learn, and what does it take to teach us? Things cannot be what we want, when we want, as we want. Other people have ideas and inputs, and why won't they leave Rat Brown alone? The future is ours to take. We're going to Mars because we have the hardware to do it. We have the rockets and the fuel and the money and the stuff. And the only reason NASA is holding back is they don't know if what they send out will be what they get back. So let me slow this down. Mars is 1 year travel to get there, plus 1 year of living on Mars, plus 1 year to return to Earth, equals 3 years of Earthlings being in a tight space, going to an unknown place with an unsure welcome awaiting them. Tired muscles, unknown and unusual foods, harsh conditions, and no known landmarks to keep them human. Only a hope and a prayer that they will be shadowed beneath a benign hand. And there is no historical precedent for that except this. The trip to Mars can only be understood through Black Americans, I say. The trip to Mars can only be understood through Black Americans. The people who were captured and enslaved immediately recognized the men who came, who chained and whipped them and herded them into ships so tightly packed there was no room to turn, no privacy to respect, no tears to fall without landing on another. We're not kind and gentle and concerned for the state of their souls, no. The men with whips and chains were understood to be killers, feared to be cannibals, known to be sexual predators. The captured knew they were in trouble in an unknown place, without communicable abilities with a violent and capricious species. But they could look out and still see signs of home. They could still smell the sweetness in the air. They could see the clouds floating above the land they loved. But there reached a point when the captured could not only not look back, they had no idea which way back might be. There was nothing in the middle of the deep blue water to indicate which way home might be. And it was that moment when a decision had to be made. Do they continue forward with a resolve to see this thing through, or do they embrace the waters and find another world? In the belly of the ship a moan was heard, and someone picked up that moan, and a song was raised, and that song would offer comfort and hope and tell the story. When we go to Mars, it's the same thing. It's middle passage. When the rocket red glares, the astronauts will be able to see themselves pull away from Earth. As the ship goes deeper, they will see a sparkle of blue. And then one day, not only will they not see Earth, they won't know which way to look. And that's why NASA needs to call Black America. They need to ask us, how did you calm your fears? How were you able to decide you were human, even when everything said you were not? How did you find the comfort in the face of the improbable to make the world you came to your world? How was your soul able to look back and wonder? And we will tell them what to do. To successfully go to Mars and back, you will need a song. Take some Billie Holiday for the sad days and some Charlie Parker for the happy ones, but always keep at least one good spiritual for comfort. You will need a slice or two of meatloaf, and if you can manage it, you will. And if you can manage it, some fried chicken in a shoebox with a moist lemon pound cake. A bottle of beer, because no one should go that far without a beer. And maybe a six-pack, so that if there is life on Mars, you can share. Popcorn for the celebration when you land, while you wait on your land legs to kick in. And as you climb down the ladder from your spaceship to the Martian surface, look to your left, and there you'll see a smiling community quilting a black-eyed pea, watching you descend. Thank you.
I love that reading because she loves it. She got good to her a couple times in that almost James Brown sort of George Clinton sense of the term. You know? So good, it's good to me. So I found out a few years ago that I had this condition that made it impossible for me to read in public anything that I had written. And it kind of dovetails with this other condition I have, which is I can't finish anything that I start writing. I just start something else. So this is an unfinished essay with 3 or 4 starts, some of which weren't even written down. First place I want to start is just kind of where I'm coming from, you know, sort of 3 occasions that kind of structure the way that I'm trying to think about Nikki Giovanni. So one is recent, actually. I'm teaching a class this semester at the Eastern Correctional Facility in Neponset, New York. And one of the students in the class is a really brilliant man named Keith Fagan. And the class is called Literary Responses to Totalitarianism. And so the first thing that we had to do in the class was to try to unravel sort of already existing assumptions and definitions of totalitarianism. First thing we had to do was to kind of maybe recognize that totalitarianism is not necessarily opposed to what people call democracy. And then we had to do an even more severe kind of work to confront the fact that what people call totalitarianism is not necessarily opposed to freedom. And it was within the context of that discussion that Keith said that the only time he had ever been happy, or that the happiest he had ever felt, was when he was a fugitive. And he said, and then he said quickly, he said, I didn't bother anybody, although they thought that I would. Their whole justification for capturing me was that they just knew that I would. He said, but I never bothered anybody. And eventually, when they caught me, the brutality of it was that they separated me from my loved ones. And we started to think that, you know, one of these sort of weird conditions of freedom is that, you know, we use jails, you know, we justify imprisoning people because the notion is that somehow their incarceration is the condition of possibility of our freedom, where part of what it means to be free is to live safely, right, out from under the thumb of a certain kind of threat. So that on the one hand, the people who run and construct the society seem to believe that their freedom is dependent upon another's unfreedom. And he was completely attuned to that irony. And then at a certain point he said, well, the closest that I've gotten to feeling something like what people call freedom is when I've been locked in the hole with other prisoners in really tight spaces, in spaces of tight confinement, where what kept us together, right, even in the absence of anything like privacy, was that we knew that we had to be together under those conditions, right? And so when Nikki Giovanni talks about tight spaces and the tight space of the hold of the ship, it resonates with me, and it resonates in my mind with Keith's formulation. So I want you to keep that a little bit, in the back of your mind. There's another couple things. So in 1905, W.B. Du Bois wrote this amazing essay called Sociology Hesitant. And I've been thinking about it for like 15 years. Very much with the help and under the protection of another couple of scholars who really discovered the essay at sort of different moments. One named R.A. Judy, who teaches at the University of Pittsburgh. Another named Nahum Chandler, who teaches at the University of California, Irvine. And this is the essay that Du Bois never published. It was in his papers at the University of Massachusetts. And there's a couple things. One of the things that I love about the essay is that it's a sort of a critique of the sort of intellectual tendency and movement called positivism, which kind of has two different, sort of variations that are maybe the most lasting. One in the development of the social sciences, and another that was sort of directly under assault in a certain way in 1905, which is positivism in physics. And if, for those of you who are real nerdy and interested in physics, 1905 is often called annus mirabilis, a miracle year, because it's the year that Albert Einstein published these 4 very famous papers that basically revolutionized physics and began to call into question certain fundamental elements of our understanding of the physical world that had been established in the work of Isaac Newton. And what it is that he's doing in 1905 is very much setting the terms and the conditions for this revolution in physics that we now know as quantum mechanics. And but what's cool about this Du Bois essay is like he's doing quantum mechanics at the same time as Einstein is opening up the way to quantum mechanics, right? It's as if he's anticipating work that really doesn't get published until the 1920s in the work of people like Niels Bohr and Werner Heisenberg, right? And one of the things he's doing is he's calling into question the sort of hard, the hegemony that in intellectual life has sort of, that we have had to suffer, right? In which part of what it is that we attempt to do when we try to know something is submitted to a certain kind of statistical analysis. He's interested in how it is that Black social life has elements that might be something that can be submitted to a statistical analysis, but that it also has fundamental elements which are just not within that frame. And so he talks about what he calls the evident rhythm of human action, which he associates with the birth rate and the death rate. But then he also talks about what he calls the incalculable rhythm of human action, which he associates with the work of a woman's club. And of course, I think he really means a Black woman's club, although I don't know exactly if he meant the Black woman's club that he thought he meant, right? maybe he thought he meant the kind of work that women like Mary Church Terrell was doing at that time, or the young Ida B. Wells, who was a kind of protege of his. But I actually think that the Black Women's Club that he was really talking about, whether he knew it or not, folks like my grandmother, who cleaned up white women's houses all day and then came home and cooked and chopped up food and quilted around kitchen tables, right? And it is this interplay of chopping up food and quilting that I want to say something about, because Nikki Giovanni is saying something about it, okay? And of course, what's really, anyway, I'm not gonna, so that's, now, the third figure who's sort of at the back of what it is I'm trying to say is a great thinker and philosopher and physicist who teaches at University of California, Santa Cruz now, named Karen Barad. And she's written a whole bunch of interesting articles in which she's sort of creating an interesting set of connections between sort of contemporary critical theory and physics. And then she's also got a great book that kind of, helps to consolidate this theoretical work that she's doing. And that book is called Meeting the Universe Halfway. And one of the really powerful things that kind of animates concepts, I guess you could say, that animates meeting the universe halfway is this notion that she has of what she calls intra-action. Okay? So imagine that interaction, let's say, like a, I guess I should say something about football being here at Florida State. So, but when I was a kid, I used to get up and watch Keith Jackson on Saturday morning calling football games. And every once in a while they would have what they call intersectional battles early in the year. I don't know if anybody remembers the use of that term, but it meant like kind of high profile non-conference games. Like maybe the most famous intersectional battle was one year when Coach John McKay's USC Trojans went to Alabama and beat the hell out of the University of Alabama, which allowed Bear Bryant to go recruit his first black players, right? Which is basically, the originary, well, let's not get into that. but inter means, it's a relationship between two things whose differences are well defined, right? As opposed to if you weren't that good of a football player or a basketball player in your high school, or maybe even here in college, you might be involved in intramural sports, right? So that there's a distinction between intercollegiate athletics and intramural sports. It means that you play people who are on your team, right, or in your school, right? In which the distinctions or the differences between units is not as well defined. Okay? So what Karen Barad is interested in is something that she calls intra-action. And she says that basically the revolution in physics that Einstein helped to produce and introduce in the early part of the 20th century, one of its effects is that it produces a condition in which we simply cannot know, right? That let's say Heisenberg's uncertainty principle tells us that we can't know the position of a particle at the same time as we can know the velocity of the particle, right? Uncertainty means that there's a gap or a kind of incompleteness at the level of our knowledge of that particle. Well, Niels Bohr's sort of interpretation of Heisenberg's uncertainty principle produces something that goes beyond uncertainty and towards a new term, indeterminacy. Right? And the notion here is that part of the reason that we cannot know the velocity of a particle at the same time as we know the position of a particle is that our presence in the world intervenes in such a way as to make that knowledge impossible, right? Okay. Our presence as measurers has an impact on that which is measured. Well, Bohr goes a little bit further, It's not simply that our presence as the measurer has an impact on what's measured. Our presence actually is structured in such a way as to radically call into question the simple division between ourselves as measurer and that which is measured. That means that instead of speaking of the interaction of the particle and the one who measures it, we speak of the interaction between those two positions, which are now on a certain level of provision, right? So interaction calls into question the radical separability of particles, right? The particle that measures on the one hand, the particle that is being measured on the other. This notion of interaction is really important because for me today, because to the extent that this talk could be called a talk and that it could be finished, if it had a subtitle, the subtitle would be The Poetics of the Introview. Not interview, but introview. Okay? So I'm at an impasse right now, okay? So, because it's already 3:49. Okay, so I'm getting nervous. So two things can happen.
Keep going.
Well, I'm gonna keep going. I'm not gonna stop. But I got 3 really dense pages, and I'm nervous about them. Because why? Why am I nervous? Because I write funny.
And that's why you're here, to do your
Let's
thing.
read it.
No, this is an issue. We have to talk about it now. So, I really want to retire so I can go back to college and study math, because then I could read these physics books that I try to read without having to skip the equations. It makes you feel like you might be missing something. I feel like physicists get a free rein, a kind of free pass when it comes to jargon and accessibility, right? They appeal to the cryptic, in somewhat secretive language for many of us of mathematics, because that language is best equipped to help them to understand the natural world as they imagine it, right? And I realized what I just said. I said to help them to understand the natural world as they imagine it. I'm not, to the extent that I'm interested in the natural world, it's because my sense is that the natural world is a kind of byproduct of what it is that we call the social world. And it's the social world that I'm trying to understand. And the language that I would appeal to in order to understand it is not the language of mathematics, but I guess it's the language of poetry. And it's created this horrible situation in which I'm supposed to be writing scholarly papers, but it comes out sounding like poetry. And I'm thinking that the reason that it comes out sounding like that is because the greater level of precision that I'm seeking comes to me in that language, right? In the way that I think when Richard Feynman or Frank Wilczek or some great physicist, when they see something in the natural world, how their intuition about it comes to them in the language of mathematics, right? And then often they figure out ways to translate, right? And but we, people when you're dealing with social things that everybody feels like they know something about because they do, they don't give you a lot of leeway when it comes to speaking in your own little technical language, because they're like, well, why can't you make it plain? And then I look at her and I'm like, why can't I write like that? Right, you were telling Marla, she was kind of telling folks in the workshop, well, I see that you didn't say what you wanted to say. And I'm like, how come I can't say what I want to say? Why? Is it a problem? Is it just a failing? Is it just a lack of ability? I don't know. But I found that what I can do is, when I'm in a situation like this, I can read what I wrote And it somehow opens up a space for me to say then what I want to say. But it's annoying because I have to interrupt myself. Okay. And what is it that I want to say? Well, part of what I want to say is I want to say these things that these voices that are in my head are telling me. The voices are like Karen Barad and Keith Fagan and, and Nikki Giovanni, right? So I recognize that I'm saying something that they've already said, or saying something that I could only say as a function of something else that they said. Or I'm saying something that appears to be contradicting what they've said, even though I don't believe that it is. I believe that it's an extension of what they've said, right? And I realize that the poetics that I'm involved in is a poetics of the interview. Because I can't really tell the difference between them and me when I'm thinking and when I'm talking. They're in me so much. And then it's like, and let's not even get into the whole problematic of my mom. Who is standing before you even as I speak. So I'm gonna read these 3 pages. I'm gonna try. But I won't get through them because I'll keep interrupting myself. Just 2 other things. There's one other figure who I neglected to mention, who I must now. There's more, but I'll get to them in the midst of it. But I didn't get to him really in what I wrote. Great German thinker named Walter Benjamin. And the formulation is really familiar for those of you, for many folks who study, 20th century thought and culture. The notion of the figure that I'm interested in is something that he calls the angel of history. He talks about a painting that he bought by great modernist painter Paul Klee. And the painting is called the Angelus Novus, the new angel. And it's a painting of a figure who appears to be in a position something like this, right? At a kind of a rest. And Benjamin offers an interpretation of that position. And he says that really so imagine that the painting that you're looking at, usually like straight across from yourself, so that the painting would have a kind of vertical relation to your verticality. But imagine that your attitude is different in that on some level you're looking down at the painting, so that the figure who you might think of as standing vertical is really leaning back, right? Essentially parallel to the ground at something like what another person who's always in my head, Hortense Spillers, would call the 0 degree of social conceptualization, right on the ground, down here on the ground in a kind of George Benson, Sam Cookish kind of sense. The angel of history is blown forward into the future by a wind from paradise. But the paradise that he's blown by into the future is now turned into nothing less than a wreck, an absolute catastrophe. So this what it means to be blown backwards into the future in a position like this, that's roughly like the position that we who are of a certain age used to notice that astronauts would be in right when they were getting ready to take off, right? That the attitude of the astronaut is one in which they were leaning back to be thrust upward and outward, right? Away from the earth. Okay. In the film, as y'all will see, Nikki Giovanni says that one of the things she loves about Black women is that they got space travel in the blood. Right? This formulation is also part of what I'm interested in trying to re-articulate, okay? So the passage in the poem that I'm kind of most concerned with is where she writes, But there reached a point where the captured could not only not look back, they had no idea which way back might be. There was nothing in the middle of the deep blue water to indicate which way home might be, and it was that moment when the decision had to be made. Do they continue forward with a resolve to see this thing through, or do they embrace the waters and find another world? In the belly of the ship, a moan was heard. And someone picked up that moan, and a song was raised. And that song would offer comfort and hope and tell the story. This poem is from a few years after Nahum Chandler and R.E. Judy discovered that Du Bois essay. And there's a moment in the Du Bois essay where he says, yes, and the thing about that incalculable rhythm of the women's club is that it emerges into our consciousness like the sudden rise of a given tune, right? So I don't know if he's prefiguring Giovanni or if she's channeling him or if they're meeting somewhere in the middle. It probably doesn't matter. Okay. Okay. So I'm going to read what I wrote, and it won't take too long. Precision will have been a function of revisionary reiteration. It's a matter of training, spelled TRANE-ING, of being raised in falling and grounding and digging, and above all, chopping it up, which is a matter of cooking, sewing, and space travel. What we have to do here, against the grain of my own disabilities, is some Black women's work. It is in this regard that the interview has to be a little bit cryptic, precisely because it better be all cryptological, all cryptographical. At first glance, it appears that the forward thrust is that of a slave ship. The thrust is forgiven, however, and has no first instance. It's not the effect of a prime and godlike mover. Rather, from before the first instance and after the lonely hour of the last, we feel and bear the force of a preference. Nikki calls it a decision for momentum, for movement, in which we see things through and see through things, i.e. see through the separability or the assumed separability of individual things. Moving forward, thrust forward into the unknown, but looking back. Angel, angle, attitude. The alternative, of course, is to stop this man from going anywhere, to stop their acting on the urge to acquire, to colonize, to settle, to seek to establish a home, and to stop ourselves from settling for the idea of another home, the idea of another world. There's the hint of a kind of fatalism in the poem, which is given in the we. This is, in part, a function of imposition, of being in this thing, of having to find some way into this thing, into which we have been thrust, and by which we've been excluded. And it is, in part of a prior claim upon an imagined destiny or destination, an arrival at what will have been our origin in what the great Jamaican literary, scientific, historical, and philosophical polymath Sylvia Wynter calls the concretely human global, the concretely we. What's the relation between this confusion of origin and end that is, in fact, the terrible baggage or the terror-filled party we carry everywhere we go as the assumption of our universal position, from whence the future and the far are fantasies from which we make what's ours to take, and the disoriented and disorientingly practical interaction of sewing and cooking at sea. Quilting a black-eyed pea is the non-local and non-human province of the homeless, the selfless, who will have always walked away in the endless approach of non-arrivance, as Creole indigeneity's ongoingly altering refusal of nativity, refusing displacement in and as displacements brailed in nameless and nameless naming. Okay, so I have to stop. I thought I was gonna have to stop much quicker, but Maybe I'm not doing so bad. So displacement. But then there's this other spelling of displacement, okay? And it's spelled D-I-S space P-L-A-C-E/M-E-A-N-T. And it's Norbesi Phillips plus Amiri Baraka. So Norbesi Phillips has this amazing essay called Displace, or Dispace. And part of what the space she's talking about is the space of colonization in Trinidad and Tobago, but she's also talking about this space between my legs, as she puts it, right? The space that is always subject to a kind of violent incursion, right? To very much the violent incursion, the kind of violent incursion that Nikki's talking about. It's why there's this little quirk in the poem. It's so deep, there's so much stuff going on, and she makes it all casual, right? But what's Marco Polo got to do with falling in love? Or what people think they mean when they say they fell in love? Which usually means I decided that I can do bad things to you, right? That's kind of what most men mean when they say it, okay? Yeah, I mean, I wish it weren't the case. So, displace, but then there's like this great poem by Amiri Baraka called Return of the Native, in which he's talking about Harlem. He's just moved up to Harlem after leaving Greenwich Village right after Malcolm X got shot. And so he's calling it Return of the Native, and he's sort of talking about himself, except for the fact that he's from Newark, right? And he doesn't stay in Harlem too long, right? But he's invested in, but you know, Harlem is, as they say, a kind of Mecca. And I think he feels like he's home because he feels like he's in this space of Black people, and he's so deeply moved to be around this incalculable social life, as Du Bois might have called it. And so at one point he says in the poem, the place and the placement of Black people, but he says M-E-A-N-T, right? And it's this very interesting, it's like 1965. And right at that same moment in France, Jacques Derrida is also interested in this relationship between spacing and meaning, you know, and Baraka always used to make fun of what he called the Negro deconstructors, but he was the first one. And I say that with love. Anyway, so that's what I kind of mean with that other displacement, but you couldn't hear it. The space trouble of space travel is in Black women's blood, and we are touched and moved by what is handed down to us. What if cooking and sewing trouble a certain mechanics of conversion that tends to make the relay between moan and song and anthem too smooth? What if cooking and sewing, quilting the Black P, right? See, I mean, I love music, and I was raised, you know, to love it, you know, by a mother who loved it. And then at the same time, I know that the discourse on Black music can be unforgivingly exclusionary in certain ways. And over the course of time, I began to kind of consider that maybe this love was misplaced, you know? And I started thinking, no, because the really important stuff is cooking and sewing, right? That's the most fundamental, the most elemental, the most bound up with our subsistence. And it was a kind of reactionary formulation, but it's still kind of true. And obviously what it is that Nikki is doing is she's sort of saying, no man, cooking and sewing and music are all bound up with one another, right? They go together, right? They're inseparable. They're different, but inseparable, right? They're interactive, right? Okay. What if cooking and sewing mess up sensual regularity and exclusivity, bringing taste and touch into tympanic mix that shakes the music's movement and capacity to move? cutting and augmenting it with uncountable, underquantized, counterclockwise impulse of aroma, which, insofar as funk not only moves, it can remove, keeps us on the way, even and especially at the kitchen table. What are the physics of an old batch of black eyes wrapped tightly round us since we are poor? What keeps our harmony off, our dissonance fugitive and never free, all anti and antiphonically unnaturalized, and always just a little out of tune as moan stays deep in surfacing? On this disarmingly beautiful day, which is literally the day after our weekly catastrophe, we need to join Toni Cade Bambara, and as she says, start with the recognition that we are at war. Provisionally, for the purposes of our own understanding provisionally, for the purposes of our own understanding, and for the desire that we wish to submit, to which we would, and for the desire to which we would submit that understanding. Okay, since I stumbled over that, it means it wasn't even close to being finished, and so I have to take a pause to try to explain. What if there's only 2 questions, y'all? Okay, and I'm being my most polite. Like I'm trying to, my vocabulary is limited. And if I am forced not to cuss, it has a negative impact on my ability to be clear. Okay? And I'm sorry, but I now have to resort to technical jargon. Okay? So there's 2 questions as far as I can tell. Okay? How shit go together? Not how do things go together. How shit go together? Because shit, unlike things, is completely free of the hegemony of the distinction between singular and plural. Right? We haven't made a decision about shit yet when it comes to that. Right? So shit allows us to maintain our commitment to the intractive, right? As opposed to making a kind of metaphysical preference for the interactive, which presumes the separability of things, right? At which point we then ask, how shit go together, right? Which, as far as I can tell, is a question about church, okay? Right? Where are you going to put Miss Lady, who you know can't get along with you? Okay? Second question is like unto it. What the fuck are we doing? Right? What are we doing? It's burning. The world is burning and drowning at the same time. Okay? We're rich and starving. Right? We're gluttonously obese, right? And starving to death at the same time. What the fuck are we doing? Right? Can we keep going this way? It appears not to be the case, right? We have to ask that question. And it's a brutal question, right? It's an uncle question. What the fuck are you doing? Right? Like, stop doing what you're doing. Okay? Right? Because it's not working. Okay? You messing something up. Okay? Those are the 2 questions. Those are the 2 questions. And these are questions that emerge once you realize that you're not in an argument, but you're at war. Right? It's not an argument, it's a war. Okay? They keep trying to get me to register for the wireless network, and so I have to keep clicking these to get back to my okay. Provisionally, the purpose of our own understanding and the desire to which we would submit that understanding, we must name this war while realizing that one name is not nearly enough. The war of conquest, the war against subsistence, the displacement, not with the A and not with the space and not with the slash, of indigeneity.
Right.
That's the triple war that we are in. Okay. We must try to understand the things that were put in motion that have affected the weather. Right? Those three elements of war affect the climate. Okay? This is a Toni Morrison / Christina Sharp formulation. Okay? All right? The destruction of native peoples on these shores, the transfer of African people to these shores has climate implications. It's a conditional possibility of this, right? It brings the industrial age online, okay? The plantation was also always a factory, and it was a lab, right, for the development of radical innovations in production. And those radical innovations in production were part and parcel of a war against subsistence, right? Because people who wanted to accumulate and make profit knew that the only way they could do it is by taking the capacity of others to subsist, right? That's how you put money in your pocket, right? Is by adversely affecting other people's capacity to live, to cook and sew, right? To have something to eat and have a little shelter and to stay warm, okay? So that's the three-pronged element of this war, okay, that Tony K. Bambara is talking about. Okay? And it's important that we call them to mind at the same time while reminding ourselves that all ideas aren't good, right? But for instance, you know, Marjorie Taylor Greene, okay, she has ideas. There's no evidence that anyone has acquired the power to determine the weather, right? But it is, in fact, most certainly the case that John von Neumann, the Hungarian-American polymath, who many people thought was the smartest person in the world until he died in the early 1950s, absolutely engaged who helped to establish the mathematical foundations upon which the atomic bomb, artificial intelligence, and neoliberal economic game theory are based, right? That while he was being an essential member of the war machine that we call the military, industrial, academic complex, he was sequestered and guarded by U.S. security forces in the last days of his fight with cancer, lest his incoherent ravings contain some technical state secret. They wouldn't even let him die in peace. They were guarding him because he had so much stuff in his head, right? But at one point, von Neumann was absolutely involved in deep research on how to control the weather. You understand? I'm not sanctioning, you know, Congresswoman Greene's, formulation. I'm just suggesting that, okay? Keeping this in mind requires and allows us to consider where the capacity and the necessity to produce greenhouse emissions came from. And to consider, moreover, that the war we're in is both physical and metaphysical. That it is given as a set of material shocks and brutalities, but also as an ideological devaluation of the invaluable, right? And I put the D in parentheses, right? Because devaluation often takes the form of valuation. We like to say, those of us who are in Black studies, right, that our lives have been devalued, as a function of slavery, but the form that devaluation took was precisely to ascribe to us a value. We were bought and sold, okay? Right, you understand? That the structure of devaluation was precisely to place a value on the invaluable, okay? And again, right, to derive value, right, which can be accumulated, okay, right, from the invaluable, which is our subsistence, which is our capacity to not so much live on the earth, but to live with it and as it. This talk, beginning with its title, which echoes a phrase uttered by Nikki Giovanni in an interview featured in the documentary Going to Mars, is meant to induce and enact meditation on Black poetry as the infinite rehearsal of an infinite conversation, an improvisational movement that Giovanni's work exemplifies. By paying a little close attention to the radical and genre-redefining richness of the interview in her work, we're going to try to see and hear how we can taste and feel as we come and go, how Black poetry, or verse, or prose, jazz, or drill, quilt, or callaloo recursively advances. It moves also in that attitude of the angel of history, in the back and forth of conversation, right? This is what she does. Everything. A poetic equation. Conversation between Nikki Giovanni and Margaret Walker. Conversations with Nikki Giovanni. You all have seen the conversations with Baldwin. She's always talking with somebody. And what you realize when you read these poems is she's talking with somebody in those too. And it's us, but it's also other people too. Her mother and father, the people in her neighborhood, right? Like in other words, her poetics is not the poetics of a kind of isolated interiority, right? It's the poetics of an integrated exteriority, right? She's in the midst of a conversation all the time, okay? I think about Nikki Giovanni and cancer, which she, as she puts it, is living with, right? It makes you think Audre Lorde, June Jordan, Barbara Christian, James Baldwin, Claudia Tate. I think of Tate because she's in this book interviewing Nikki Giovanni, right? Wrote a great book called Black Women Writers at Work. She died in 54, in 2002, right? Okay. And it makes me really think of Octavia Butler, okay? It's all about what it is to live in and with degenerativity, right? This interplay of generativity and degeneration that is, in fact, also the conditional possibility of our subsistence. And it's why she says she lives with cancer. She doesn't fight it. She lives with it, right? It's a deep formulation. And of course, the great theorist of this question of how to live with cancer is Octavia Butler in the Xenogenesis novels, right? Right? Where these aliens called the Oncology, right, are chemically in love, right, with humans, because what they sense in humans is this radical capacity for unchecked generativity, right, which they can taste in their biological experiments with humans, right? In other words, they love cancer. They're attracted to it, like libidinally, because they're totally interested in what it means to be able to activate and accelerate this capacity for generativity, right? And how it is inevitably bound up almost immediately with degeneration. She chooses to live with that. Okay? One way to think of it, it's living with difference. It's living with a difference which is internal to what you thought was your body. Not a rejection of difference, right? But an ethical comportment towards it. That absolutely is compatible with desiring to continue to live, right? The attitude of the astronaut in reclining, recombinant forward thrust, looking more up and out than back, looking more down and into the wreck, into the sea, which is, as Tourmaline says by way of Marsha P. Johnson and Philip, a sea of bones and a sea of moans. And so we seek to recover and amplify a feel and a field of exhausted and exhaustive underbreath. This is our maternal ecological imperative, and it demands that we cleave to the structure of the intraview. The maternal ecology is one of conversation, which is to say conservation. of militant preservation, not the tired, nostalgic, musty, Elon Musky futurism that will have ended or arrived only when the man who is the last man is the last thing on earth, which is the necessary precondition for owning everything. You have to kill everything to own everything, and that will have ended only with the death of the brutal illusion of himself. But it's not that retro and necessarily retrograde Afrofuturism that is predicated on its desire to get back to its own piece of the rock either, as precondition for the racial democratization of sovereignty. We hold and release choirs. In practical is everybody all right? You all right? Okay. All right. We hold and release choirs in practical application of the knowledge that the soloist is not one. This is our angelic history. My job is to help you remember that we all have something to say. This is ethical, physical obligation. Conversation as conservation is what we owe to one another past the fiction of one and another. And that's Nikki Giovanni's poetics. And that's all I have.
Oh, come on.
So, should I get out? Let me get out.
I feel like this is church.
Yeah.
Hello, everyone. So remember when Dr. Sperling said that Fred Moten's work is something that you don't read, you rehearse. So I've written a lot of things as I was sitting over here. We'll see what happens. To respond in the moment to someone who I am trained to reread, right? And commune with and study. This is an interesting exercise, but we'll see what happens here. On September 26th, a terrible miracle happened here. A different miracle than the field of physics discovered in Du Bois's 1905. Our terrible miracle is that we were spared. As predictive modeling foresaw a direct hit on Tallahassee by Hurricane Helene, a singular pocket of cold air shifted that storm 10 miles to the east. That one ecological made the difference between our illusion of safety and what local meteorologists called, quote, our utter ruin. That small catch of breath let us unclench our jaws and resume what FSU loves to call normal operations. In a 2018 interview with Mark Anthony Neal on the Webby Awarded show Left to Black, you instruct us that the project of Black study is, quote, not just the redemption of Black people or about the liberation of Black people. It's at this stage now the continued capacity for the earth to carry human existence. And our tradition of Black studies has something specific and important and indispensable to say about that. It's at this stage now, the Katrina stage, the Helene stage, the Milton stage. What the fuck are we doing? This is not working. So as we gaze skyward to contemplate how to survive and build anew what the Plantationocene has wrought, to render revolutions of otherwise, to evoke a Sean Crawley, that cosmological world-making demands what Nikki Giovanni calls, and what was elucidated today, that forward thrust of blackness. That work must begin, in my estimation, with a recalibration of the capacity of our we, to reconsider how we define the inter and the intra, that assumed separability, to echo Fred today. Because I have been haunted by the phrase, we were spared. Because our terrible miracle has been another's, Asheville's horror. That is not an earthling we. It's antisocial and it's selfish and it's irresponsible. It's a we that operates more like an us when us is versus them. And we need to be in conversation in the way Giovanni models and Moten reminds us to live with. We should know we can't rely on miracles or the Mag Lab Tallahassee is not going to save us. So in this emergency, we must turn to the modeling and possibilities of Black study, because it will be the wind, or the water, or the fire next time. Let's take it to Q&A, please. Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, I did it.
You did it. You did it.
All right, so how are we doing this? Does someone have a question, or you want me to start out with one? Because the question I have, other than how, help us to not keep fucking up, right, is how does Black poetry help us save the world?
For me, like, one of the most important, there's been a lot of great poetry that's, come out in the last few years. And one of the books that I return to constantly is by a great poet, great Black poet named Ed Rose. And he's got a poem and a book, both of which are titled "To See the Earth Before the End of the World." And I think that maybe the thing I would say a little more precisely now than what I said talking with Mark Anthony, everybody just calls him Man. But talking with Man is, I don't know that, I think maybe that the real question is, how do we relinquish world? How do we relinquish that idea? How do we relinquish the idea of world, which is a human construction, and which I think has as its essential feature the notion of human dominion. And I think that what Ed is trying to say is that we need, if we don't see the earth, and if we don't see sort of with earth and as earth, if we don't refuse our separability from earth, if we don't refuse the assumed separability that allows us to imagine that the earth is at our grasp, where grasp is both a condition of ownership, but also an epistemological condition. The idea that the earth is somehow utterly and completely knowable and transparent to us, or should be. That if we don't relinquish those ideas, then it will be the end of this world that we have created, and we won't survive that end. So maybe the way I would want to think about it now is we have to let world go so we can kind of come back down to earth, in a way. Yeah.
Thank you. Do we have questions in the audience?
Define Black poetry.
Define Black poetry.
Thank you, Ted. It's funny. I got maybe like 2 definitions of it, and I recognize that on some fundamental level they're contradictory. So, just maybe more generally with, the thinking that I've been doing along with some friends, I feel like a lot of that thinking is kind of predicated on the notion that it is important to make a distinction between Blackness and the people who are called Black. At the same time, there's all this beautiful stuff that has been both left to the people who are called Black to protect and to claim when no one else would ever have wanted to claim it. And we have come to call those things collectively Blackness, but they're not the property of the people who are called Black. And they're not a property exclusively of the people who are called Black. So with that said, my first impulse is to say that Black poetry is the poetry that's written by Black people. But I'm really as interested as I am, and I'm interested in the poetry that has been written by Black people because it historically has been the best place to find Blackness in poetry. But the way I read is I find Blackness in Shakespeare, who I think would probably be relatively happy about it, and like in Wallace Stevens, who I know would be pissed. As here we are in Florida, that venereal soil. I'm making it sound more complicated than it is. It ain't that complicated. It's only complicated because sometimes people feel better about owning something than they do about sharing it. And why wouldn't you feel better about owning something rather than sharing it when your whole experience is to have been constantly bought and sold yourself, and to have been constantly stolen from, and also to have been stolen? Okay, so I understand and I feel the impulse to protect Blackness, to protect, but I also know that what is it that we're protecting? What we're protecting is not something that we own. What we're protecting is an active, practical resistance to ownership, right? That's what, so it's not complicated, it's just hard. So.
Other questions? Yes, I think I just come to you. So you've mentioned a lot about the idea of this transitionality, going between these places, and we've talked a lot about the journey itself. We've talked about where we're going. We're going to Mars. But how would you define the place that we're coming from? In both, what is the Earth that we're leaving? What is the theoretical Africa that is being left on the slave ship? Like, what is that, truly?
Well, I remember. Okay, so I feel like there's a double edge to your we, because there's definitely a double edge to Nikki's we in that poem. Like that we is like, America, on some level, right? And it's, she's parodying the jingoistic celebration of the spirit of exploration, which is always also a spirit of settlement, and coloniality. And she's saying, it's not some uncritical, valorization of space flight, right? She's saying, like she says in the poem explicitly, there's something wrong with us and we don't want to fix it, Let's say that, interestingly, one way to describe this malady is that it is a desire for home, right? A desire to not just to settle, but to be settled, right? A desire to regulate flux and difference and indeterminacy and contingency, right? And that desire is often done, in the name of and in the interest of accumulation, right? And inequality. Now, the question you ask is a tough question. It's like for me, it's like a half a Hortense Spillers, half a Saidiya Hartman question. It's like a lose your mother question. It's like what happened anyway, by the way, is Spillers, what happened? Just, we have to talk, So that's her sort of Afro-diasporic, well, how we get over here? We didn't get over here. We obviously, we didn't get over here by ourselves, and obviously it wasn't just them, and we have to, now look, these are questions that I think ought to be taken out of the realm of personal morality, okay? But there's a way in which, for me, one time I think I read something where Spillers was talking about, and another scholar whose name I can't remember, were talking about, Equiano's narrative. Well, what happened? Why was this little boy sold, right? And one formulation was that he was sold because he was too close to the mother, right? There was like, as if there were a violation of a certain notion of masculinity, right? What I'm trying to get at here, okay, I'm just beginning to delve into and to dig into the kind of historical work that would maybe allow me to ask, to echo your question, to ask it in a way that would make sense to me, just getting it out of my mouth, But I guess what I'm saying is that the imperial impulse, the impulse for home, right? The impulse to accumulate, those are not strictly and exclusively European impulses, right? These are, and that's something that we have to ask with regard to contemporary African America, as much as we also have to ask with regard to Africa 400 years ago, right? Like what, I'll really, see, I kind of feel like at some point in the 12th and 13th centuries, something weird was happening all over the world. I know it was happening in Europe. I know it was happening in Korea, in China, in Japan. And I am beginning to believe, based on a little bit of reading, that it was also happening in Africa as well. And I think there were two things going on, okay? One was, sorry, I shouldn't even say this kind of shit. I know it sounds very cranky, but an eruption of a kind of epistemological, philosophical attitude that I would associate with the word mysticism, okay? And an eruption of a set of ideas about communal subsistence that I would associate with the word communism. Okay? And I believe that the forces of modernity and of the so-called progress that is supposed to go along with modernity, that these forces were brutally and viciously arrayed against this uprising. And I think that that's a lot of the history that we need to understand, let's say, of the years between 1200 and 1500. And that, and that this is a very important, that historical moment, which a lot of times people want to talk about under the rubric of the medieval or the Dark Ages, right? Was somehow displaced and suppressed in the name of a rebirth, of the philosophy of atomism, of individuation, right? You ever had a book be really kind of horrific and yet it's totally instructive? It's horrific because of what it's arguing and because of how, but it's sort of well done. So you're wincing the whole time you're reading it, okay? That's the latest book by Stephen Greenblatt called The Swerve, for me, right? And it's really about, so it's about Lucretius. And it's about, so what Greenblatt is essentially arguing is that Lucretius's philosophy of atomism, which was sort of suppressed and lost in a lot of what is the so-called Middle Ages, is beginning to be revived in the 14th and 15th centuries, and that the effect of it, right, is two things. One thing that we call the Renaissance, the rebirth, and then what emerges from the Renaissance, which is the birth of liberalism. Okay? What he neglects is to say that there's another thing that was happening around that same historical moment, right? Conquest, okay? And the emergence of what one might call the exportation of settler colonialism from Europe, which has its first, flowering as an intra-European affair. Foucault talks about this, Cedric Robinson talks about this, right? The brutal, it was again, takes the form of the displacement of indigeneity, right? The enclosure of common land so that some peasant in Yorkshire has to move, right, to London in order to not eat, right? These are, same thing in France, same thing. You understand? Shakespeare's great at this. To me, the greatest Shakespeare plays is that, that four-play cycle that goes from Richard II to Henry V, because it's the story of this process. And one way to think about it is, it's the story of the emergence of a political theory of sovereignty, right? That emerges as a function of the realization in the figure of the king that sovereignty is precisely made, right? And not natural, okay? That's why Henry V is always saying shit like, Henry IV, presume not that I am the thing I was. I will rather now be more like myself. Right? They're understanding that sovereignty is a performed, right, thing and not a natural thing, right? Kings can be deposed and then replaced, okay? And so what I'm trying to say, and it's all against the backdrop of peasant rebellion in England in the 14th century. And it's against the backdrop of religious insurgency, right? That takes the form of mysticism, right? And that mysticism often manifests itself as a kind of, but we see the same thing in Korea, right? And it's these innovations that we now can talk about under the rubric of certain explosions in the history of Buddhism, right? And I think it's happening in India. You see, I don't know what's going on in that period, but the world is full of flux there, okay? And it's at that same, there's, and there are modalities of imperial force that are emerging in Africa in the same way. So we now look back on those historical moments as moments of darkness, right? That needed to be suppressed and overcome in the interest of the emergence of the sovereign figure of the individual, right? And I guess I want to say two things. I don't think Africa is exempt from that history. And I think our presence on these shores has something to do with Africa's place in that history. But and again, I think there's lots of people who are already investigating, this is, anyway, blah, blah, blah. So, but I tried to address the question because you asked me, but I feel funny about it because I have an intuition about this stuff, but I don't know enough to, I could be horrifically wrong, but I'm not.
Okay, you might think right now you have a burning question and you want to ask it, but we are out of time. But do not despair, right? Because this is only part one of the excellent programming of Going to Mars. So you have the opportunity to join the conversation between Fred Moten and Nikki Giovanni on Thursday, October 24th. Details to follow. Thank you. Thank you.